Welcome to the Vietnamese Poetry, Literature channel. Today we will listen to the work, Picked Wife, by author Kim Lan. Let's listen. Before, every afternoon, at dusk, Trang would come home from work. He walked hesitantly on the spindly path through the market neighborhood of the residence and into the wharf. He smiled as he walked. The two children were tiny, the chickens were immersed in the afternoon shadow, both sides of their jaws were white, shaking, making his rough face always flicker with reasonable thoughts. Ferocious beast. He has a habit of walking and talking. He babbles and complains about what he thinks. The children in the neighborhood, every time they saw his big, bulky body coming down from the market slope, they all rushed out to surround him, shouting with laughter. Ah! And Trang. Mr. Trang has returned, everyone. Trang, please hold me. Mr. Trang, have you been drinking? Mr. Trang. Some grabbed the front, some grabbed the back, some tickled, some pulled, some dragged bare feet. Trang just looked up and laughed. That shabby neighborhood stirs for a while every afternoon. But these days, no children bother to come out to welcome Trang anymore. They sit sullenly in the corners of the street, not bothering to move. In the twilight of the afternoon, Trang walked wearily step by step, her brown shirt draped over one arm, her bald head tilted forward. It seemed like the worries and struggles of the day weighed down on his back as big and wide as a bear's. Hunger has come to this neighborhood since when? Families from the Nam Dinh and Thai Binh regions, carrying mats, carried each other, holding each other up like ghosts, and lying scattered all over the market tent. Dead people are like straw. There is not a morning when people in the village go to the market or work in the fields without seeing 3 or 4 corpses lying crumpled on the side of the road. The air was filled with the rotten smell of garbage and the smell of human corpses. In the midst of that dark scene of hunger and thirst, one afternoon people in the neighborhood suddenly saw Trang returning with another woman. His face had an unusually cheerful look. He smiled to himself and his eyes sparkled. The woman walked about 3 or 4 steps behind him. She carried a small basket, her head bowed slightly, her tattered hat tilted to cover half of her face. T seemed cautious and shy. The children found it strange and quickly ran out to watch. Afraid that they would joke like before, Trang quickly turned serious and shook her head to signal disapproval. A few children stopped, looked at Trang, and suddenly someone shouted, "Mr. Trang." Trang turned back. She arched her neck and screamed again, "Husband and wife are funny." Trang laughed. "Dad." The woman seemed very uncomfortable. T furrowed her eyebrows and raised her hand to shake her shirt. The intersection of the market village in the afternoon becomes more and more desolate and desolate. Every wind blows in from the fields, interrupting. Both sides of the street are dark, no house has lights or fire. Under the rough banyan trees and rice roots, the silhouettes of hungry people move silently like ghosts. The sound of crows on the rice plants outside the market kept screaming in pain. Looking at Trang's shadow and the woman's figure slowly walking back to the wharf, the people in the neighborhood were very strange. They stood in the doorway looking out and chatting. It seems they understand a bit. Their dark, haggard faces suddenly brightened. There was something strange and fresh blowing into their hungry, dark life. One person sighed. Another person quietly asked, "Who is that? ... Or is it someone from the hometown of Mrs. Tu who just came up?" "That's not true. Since the days of Mr. Tu's grave, I haven't seen any Mac family coming to visit." "Weird, huh?" There was a moment of silence, then someone suddenly burst out laughing. "Or is it Mr. Trang's wife? Wow, your wife really is Trang's boyfriend. She looks shy and thoughtful. Oh my. This earth still brings back life's debts. Do you know if we can support each other through this?" They both remained silent. The woman seemed to know that people around her were looking at her, so she became even more awkward, one foot touching the other. He also knew that, but he found it very pleasing, his face still puffing up with pride at himself. The woman grumbled something in her mouth. He turned back and asked, "What? Or not?" He also grumbled, "Why do they look so healthy?" He suddenly stopped and looked sideways. "Hey, Mr. Trang. Uncle Trang." Behind a dark door, a bald head poked out and called out in a startled voice. Trang hurriedly turned back. "How late will you be back? Come play now." Trang stood back and said, "Please leave it until another day." The bald head winked one eye and nodded towards the humorous woman. "Which wing is it?" "Aha, acquaintance. Let's leave it for another day." He turned around and quickly ran after the woman, like someone embarrassed and running away. The woman went to the old temple. Trang calls with, "Turn this way." "Over here?" "Yes." The two quietly turned down a small road. The road is deep and deep, passing between two tall bamboo banks. "It's quiet and comfortable here." He wanted to say a few affectionate words to her but didn't know what to say. He kept feeling awkward, rubbing one hand on the other's shoulder as he walked beside the woman. T did not say anything, her eyes looked thoughtfully ahead. The sound of the wind rustling on the bamboo bank and the sound of dry leaves rustling under the feet. For a moment, Trang seemed to forget all the miserable and dark scenes of daily life, forget the terrible hunger and thirst that was threatening, and forget all the days ahead. In his heart now there is only the love between him and the woman next to him. Something new, very strange, never seen before in that poor man. It hugged and caressed Trang's skin, as if there was a hand gently caressing his spine. "Have you come yet?" the woman suddenly asked. "About to. Is anyone home?" "I'm alone." T smiled. "I'm alone and still have a few tumors. It's so small." He laughed. "Oh yeah. The story seems familiar." He walked closer to her, thinking for a moment, then suddenly he raised the bottle he was still holding in one hand to show off. "Here's the dark oil. Isn't it luxurious? Pretty good. 2 dimes, too expensive, but I don't need it. Hoang, it's just right." He clicked his tongue. The new wife also needs to let her be a little brighter, maybe she will snuggle in before it's dark, hee hee. "Damn it." T slapped him on the back and frowned. He likes to throw his head back and laugh. The startled dogs ran into the ramparts, sticking their muzzles out and barking. Trang picked up a brick, waved his hand and threw it hard. "What did your mother and father bite? Haven't arrived yet? Still bored? Terrible." T frowned and struggled. He burst out laughing, bent down, lifted the branch from the gate, and shouted, "Here it is." T quietly followed him into the house. The empty house stood huddled in a garden overgrown with tufts of weeds. T rolled her eyes and looked around, her thin chest sticking out, and suppressed a sigh. Trang Tattooed entered the house, lifted the torn screen aside, cleaned up the pots, bowls, and clothes that were scattered all over the bed and on the floor. He turned back to look at her and smiled. "Without a woman, that's the house." T curled her lips and smiled blandly, patting the bed rhythmically. "Sit here. Sit down here, naturally." The woman followed his instructions and sat down on the edge of the bed. Both suddenly felt awkward. Trang stood blankly in the middle of the house for a moment, then suddenly he felt scared. He himself didn't understand why he was afraid. He hurriedly took a few steps out into the yard and shouted, "I don't know why the old lady came home so late today." He wandered around, ran to the alley to wait, then ran to the yard to peek inside the house. She was still sitting on the edge of the bed, holding the basket with both hands, her face blank. He thought to himself, why the heck is he so sad? Oh, why is he so sad? He spat idly, smiling to himself. Looking at her sitting right in the middle of the house, even now he still doubts that it's not the case. So he already has a wife? River. He didn't expect it to actually happen, he was just talking about it, but in 2 days they became husband and wife. Not long ago, he took the Union rice cart to the province. Every time I pass the warehouse door, I see girls sitting here. He guessed they sat there picking up scattered seeds, or whoever had a job called them did it. One time, he was pulling a cart of rice to the province, so he sang a song to ease his fatigue. He shouted, "I want to eat these rolls of white rice. Come here and push the cart with me, hey." He didn't intend to tease any of the girls, but the girls kept pushing this girl's shoulders away from him, laughing hysterically. "Hey, he's calling. If you want to eat some steamed rice, go push the cart with him." T Kong Kong. There are several rolls of white rice. "Hey, my dear, are you telling the truth or bragging?" Trang looked back and wiped the sweat from her face and smiled. "Really, if you push it, it will come out quickly." The lady stood up and ran back to push Trang's cart. "If it's true, then push it, why be afraid?" T glanced and smiled. Trang likes it very much. From his birth father to now, no girl has ever smiled at him so lovingly. The second time, Trang had just finished returning the goods and was sitting outside the gate of the provincial market drinking water when the market suddenly came running from somewhere. T stood in front of him and said sullenly, "You people like that are crazy." He looked up at her, not understanding. Actually, at that time he didn't even realize who she was. Today she was so torn, her clothes were as tattered as a nest of leeches, she was completely skinny, and on her gray plowshare face only 2 eyes remained. "That day, I sneaked up on the appointment, but I lost face." Ah, he remembered now, he grinned. "If not that day, then today. Now sit down and have a bite to eat. Eat whatever you want, don't eat rich." T was still standing awkwardly in front of him. "Here, eat whatever you want." He patted his pocket. "Rich dad, huh?" Her 2 sunken eyes immediately lit up, she said. "Really eat?" "Yes, there's no need to be afraid of eating." So she sat down to eat. T concentrated on eating 4 bowls of bon duck at a time without talking. After eating, she held her chopsticks across her mouth and breathed. "Ha, delicious." When she returned home, she saw that she was short of money and left her father. He laughed. "I don't have a wife. This is a joke, but if you come back with me, go load the groceries into the car and go home together." Trang thought it was a joke when he said that, but he didn't expect her to really come back. At first, the guy was confused, thinking, "I don't know if I can raise all this rice, and it's too much." After not knowing what to think, he clicked his tongue. "TCH, never mind." That day he took her to the provincial market and spent money to buy her a small basket containing a few small things, then went to the rice shop to have a full meal and then pushed the cart back. Trang suddenly stopped and listened. Outside the alley there was the sound of someone coughing. An old woman walked into the alley from outside the bamboo grove. The old woman walked away muttering some calculations in her mouth. Seeing her mother, Trang cried out like a child, and called into the house. "You are back." He hurriedly ran out to greet her. "Why are you home so late today? Makes me feel hot all over." Mrs. Tu blinked her eyes at Trang and slowly asked, "What's going on?" "Well, let's go inside the house first." The old woman hesitantly followed her child into the house. When she reached the middle of the yard, the old woman stopped and was even more surprised. "Damn, why is there a woman in there? What kind of woman would stand right at the head of her son's bed like that? Why salutations with you? Not Duke's children. Who is that?" The old woman blinked her eyes to relieve the blurring because she suddenly felt her eyes blurring. The old woman looked closely at both women and men, still not recognizing anyone. The old woman turned around and looked at her child, showing that she did not understand. Trang smiled. "Well, why don't you go sit on the bed and take a swing? The old woman staggered in. The woman thought the old woman was old and deaf, so she said hello again. You are back. Oh great, what's that like? The old woman sat down on the bed wonderingly. Trang reminded her mother. Hey, it's my house, he says hello. Seeing that his mother still did not understand, he stepped closer and continued. My family just came to be my friend, sir. We are destined for each other. It's just fate. The old woman bowed her head and remained silent. The old lady understood. That poor mother's heart still understood so many problems, both lamenting and pitying her child's fate. Alas, people marry their children to their wives when they can do well at home, but hope to have children and open their eyes later. As for me, 2 streams of tears fell from the corners of her eyes. Do you know if they can feed each other and survive this hunger and thirst? The old woman sighed softly and stood up, staring at the woman. T looked down, her hands fiddled with the tattered hem of her shirt. The old woman looked at her and thought, people have to face this difficult, hungry step, so they marry their children. But only my son has a wife. Well, it's her duty as a mother, she can't take care of her son. Luckily, if she can get past this situation, her son will also have a wife and he will be at peace. It's unfortunate that even if God forces you to die, how can you take care of it all? The old woman gently cleared her throat and gently said to the new bride. Yes, well, you guys are destined to be together, I'm so happy. He breathed a sigh of relief, his chest felt lighter. He coughed softly and took long steps out into the yard. Mrs. Tu still slowly continued. My family is poor, son. Husband and wife, please tell each other to do business. Then luckily, God blesses you well. How do you know, son, who is rich in 3 families, who is poor in 3 generations? If it comes out, your children will come home later. The old woman stared out. Darkness covers both eyes. In the distance, the bright white river meandered in the dark fields. The smell of burning bamboo piles in houses where people have died wafts in with the acrid wind. The old woman let out a long sigh. The old woman thought of the old man, thought of bringing her youngest daughter. The old woman thought about her long, miserable life. When they get married, will their lives be better than their parents before? Sit down here. Sit down here to relieve your tired legs. The old woman looked at the woman, filled with pity. She is now the daughter-in-law and daughter of the family. The woman moved slightly, she still stood still in the same place. The old woman lowered her voice intimately. Even if we could make a few trays, that's fine, but our family is poor, so no one would accept it just for now. As long as you all get along, I'm happy. This year is very hungry. You guys are getting married now, I'm so sad. The old lady choked and couldn't speak anymore, tears kept flowing down her eyes. Trang stood outside and saw this. He was so upset that he walked into the house, struck a match and lit the lamp. Seeing the light, the old woman quickly wiped away her tears. Is there a light? Well, light it up a bit to brighten it up. Oil is so expensive these days. The old woman stood up lazily and went to the other bed to lie down. Trang grumbled in his mouth, it's so boring, I suddenly cry no matter where I go. Old Lady Tu's voice on the other side said to Sang. Every day when I stay home, I get some bamboo to weave a wicker to block it. Yes. Trang obediently answered her mother's words. He wanted to turn around and tell her to take off her shirt and lie down, but seeing her sitting motionlessly at the foot of the bed, he naturally didn't dare. He quietly sat down on the chair next to him, both of them embarrassed and not knowing what to say. The dull yellow light in the corner of the house radiates warmth and lengthens 2 shadows on the wall. Outside, the wind blew from the river surface, whispering like the sound of people whispering. Amid the silence of the new couple, there was the sound of someone crying in the neighborhood, loud and small. The woman suddenly sighed. Trang turned back and asked softly. Are you sad? Or not? It's terrible that we're talking so long right now, I'm so impatient waiting. T glared at him and did not answer. He leaned back and smiled. It's late, go to sleep. T raised her hand and touched his forehead. That's all it takes to be fast. Dirty. He chuckled, stretched his neck and blew out the lamp. In the dead of night, the sound of crying is heard more clearly. The next morning, when the sun rose, Trang woke up. The person floated softly inside, like someone who had just come out of a dream. Even today, he is still surprised that he has a wife. He clasped his hands behind his back and slowly walked out into the yard. The bright summer morning sunlight penetrated his stinging eyes. He blinked several times, and suddenly realized that something new and different had changed around him. Today, the house and garden are all swept and tidied up. A few pieces of clothes as tattered as a nest of leeches, still hanging in a corner of the house for decades, were brought out to dry in the yard. The 2 water tanks that were left dry under the guava tree were filled to the brim with water. The pile of trash and humus that was scattered across the path was completely cleaned up. Outside in the garden, the mother is digging through the clumsy tufts of grass. His wife swept the yard again, the sound of the broom scraping on the ground. The scene was simple and ordinary, but for him it was very poignant and touching. Suddenly he found himself strangely attached to his home. He has got a family. He and his wife will have children there. The house is like a warm nest that protects from rain and sun. A source of joy and excitement suddenly filled my heart. Now he sees that he is a good man, he feels that he has a duty to take care of his wife and children in the future. He ran out to the middle of the yard. He also wanted to do something to help renovate the house. Mrs. Tu suddenly saw that her daughter was awake. The old woman gently told her daughter-in-law. He's awake. It's not too late for me to go prepare dinner. Yes. The woman quietly walked into the kitchen. Trang looks very different today. It's clear that she's a gentle and proper woman who no longer has the arrogant appearance that Trang has met several times outside the province. I wonder if it's because she's newly married that she's determined to do business? Trang's mother was also relieved, brighter than usual, her gloomy face brightened. The tattooed old woman tidied up and swept the house. It seems that everyone has the idea that by keeping their house clean and orderly, their lives can be different and their business will be better off. Meal on a hungry day looks miserable. In the middle of the ragged basket there was a grove of chopped banana vegetables, and a plate of salt to eat with porridge, but the whole family ate very well. The old woman ate while telling business and family stories to her daughter-in-law. The old woman talked only about happy things, only about happiness in the future. Trang. When we have money, we can buy a pair of chickens. I believe that where the chef made a chicken coop is very convenient. Look around and you'll see a flock of chickens right away. Trang said yes. Trang is very obedient. Never before in this house have mother and child been so warm and harmonious. The fun conversation during the meal suddenly stopped. The porridge pot was empty, each person had 2 empty bowls. The old woman put down her chopsticks and bowl and looked at her 2 children happily. We'll wait for you. I have this really cool one. She hurriedly ran down to the kitchen and politely brought out a pot of steam rising from it. The old woman put the pot down next to the rice bowl, held her lips while stirring and smiling. Here's some tea. The old woman scooped out a bowl. This sweet soup is delicious. The daughter-in-law picked up the bowl, raised it to her eyes, and her eyes turned dark. Tea calmly entered her mouth. Trang held the second bowl her mother gave her. The mother was still smiling and cheerful. Thank you, hee hee. It's delicious, just try it and see. In our neighborhood, we don't even have bran to eat. Trang picked up a pair of chopsticks, took a piece and quickly put it in his mouth. His face immediately tightened, the bran was bitter and choking in his throat. From then on, no one said a word at the meal, they just sat down to finish eating, avoiding looking at each other. A sadness crept into everyone's minds. Outside the communal house, suddenly there was a drumbeat, loud and hasty. The flock of crows on the towering rice plants outside the market yard flew up in panic, gliding in groups and flying across the sky like dark clouds. The daughter-in-law sighed softly, she whispered in her mouth. Something empty, huh? It's a tax drum. On the one hand, they force you to pay taxes, on the other, they force you to pay taxes. I'm not sure if I can survive this world, my children. The old woman quickly turned around and went out. The old woman did not dare let her daughter-in-law see her cry. The daughter-in-law seemed very strange, she mumbled. Do we still have to pay taxes here? After a moment of silence, she continued. In Tai Nguyen and Bakjeong, people refused to pay taxes anymore. People even destroyed Japanese granaries and gave them to the hungry. Trang then looked thoughtful. His huge face was tight, making it difficult to stare. The bran stuck in his mouth had turned sour. He was thinking of the people who destroyed Japanese granaries. Trang asked quickly while eating. Viet Minh, right? Yes, how do you know? Trang did not answer. In his mind, a scene of poor people noisily marching on the Sop Dike appeared. There is a big red flag in front. That day he vaguely heard people say they were Viet Minh. They went to steal rice. Trang was so scared that he quickly pulled the Federation's rice cart off the cave and went another way. Well, they went to destroy the granary to give to the hungry. Suddenly he felt regretful and incomprehensible. Outside the pavilion, the sound of drums and taxes continued to pound. Trang's mother and wife put down their chopsticks and stood up. In Trang's mind, she still sees hungry people and a fluttering red flag. At the end of the work, please support me with the like button and subscribe to the channel to listen to more works.